He was a beloved neighbor, a trusted contractor, and a clown who made children laugh. But under his house lay a horror no one could have imagined, 26 bodies buried in silence. This is the story of John Wayne Gacy, the man they called the Killer Clown. If you want more true stories like this, stories that expose what hides behind the mask, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942, in a modest Chicago neighborhood, to what many would call a typical working-class family. But behind their thin walls, a very different story unfolded, one shaped not by warmth but by fear. His father, a World War I veteran and factory laborer, ruled the household with an iron hand and a bottle in the other. Gacy was often the target of his father's drunken rages, beaten with belts, berated with cruel words, and mocked even as he tried to stand tall. What happens to a child who learns early that love must be earned through obedience, and that approval is something always just out of reach? Gacy's early years were marked by illness and isolation. A heart condition kept him away from sports and peers. Instead of playgrounds, he spent time alone, watching, imitating, and learning how to adapt. Was this where he first began to understand the power of performance? Even in pain, Gacy was determined to please. He helped around the house, avoided confrontation, and smiled through bruises. But no matter what he did, his father saw weakness. When he tried to make friends, his father accused him of being a sissy. And yet, in public, Gacy wore the face of the cheerful, obedient son. How long can a boy wear that mask before it becomes a part of him? As a young man, Gacy sought out approval wherever he could find it. He dropped out of high school, drifted from job to job, and eventually ended up managing a KFC in Iowa, thanks to his father-in-law. There he married, started a family, and for a time appeared settled. But beneath the surface, Gacy's need for control, and something far darker, was beginning to take shape. During this period he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He spent 18 months in prison, long enough for his wife to divorce him and take the children. When he got out, he moved back to Illinois and tried again. New home, new business, new image. In Norwood Park, a quiet suburban area near Chicago, Gacy founded PDM Contractors. He worked long hours, hired young men, mostly teenagers, and told neighbors he was just giving kids a shot. But how many of them never came back? It was there he rebuilt his reputation, becoming a respected businessman, known for his energy and charm. He joined the local Democratic Party, became a precinct captain, and took pride in his political connections. He even met First Lady Rosalind Carter. What kind of man manages to fool everyone, even the Secret Service? To the world, John Wayne Gacy was a man of second chances, a man who had turned his life around, a man everyone seemed to like. But behind every laugh, every handshake, every campaign badge and clown nose, was a person no one really knew. How well do we ever know the people we live beside? What if the man handing out balloons is also planning where to dig the next grave? John Wayne Gacy's life in Norwood Park was carefully constructed, layered with charm, appearances, and a successful business. By day he ran PDM Contractors, a well-established construction company. He hired young men, mostly teenagers, to work for him, offering jobs that seemed like golden opportunities for boys looking to make some extra money or find steady work. But for Gacy, these boys were more than just employees. They were pawns in a dark game he had begun playing, and they didn't even know it. He was, after all, the friendly boss, the man who promised opportunity. He was a figure of authority, someone the boys respected, and someone they would never suspect. But beneath the surface of a businessman lay something far darker, a predator who knew how to charm, manipulate, and control. When not overseeing his construction jobs, Gacy slipped into the persona of Pogo the Clown. It was more than just a costume, it was a shield, a mask he wore to perform in front of children at hospitals, birthday parties, and parades. His oversized shoes and painted face made him a beloved figure in the community. To the children, he was a symbol of joy, of innocence, of entertainment. A man who would show up and make them laugh even if the world around them felt bleak. But how could anyone have known that behind the grease paint was a man capable of horrific acts? How many times did he shake a child's hand, stand for a photo, and then disappear into the night to commit the unthinkable? What made John Wayne Gacy so dangerous was his ability to mask his true nature. With a killer's instinct, he understood that charisma was a weapon. He used his charm like a weapon, drawing people in, making them believe that he was trustworthy, even likable. People would describe him as friendly, outgoing, and generous. A man who was always the life of the party, always the first to volunteer, always the first to offer a helping hand. But behind that facade was a growing pathology, a deepening need to dominate, control, and destroy. His mask didn't just hide his true nature. It created a version of himself that everyone around him adored. How often do we mistake charm for goodness? How often do we fall for the persona someone creates, unaware of the darkness they harbor? But Gacy's carefully constructed life began to unravel, slowly but surely. In 1968, in Iowa, his manipulative ways caught up with him when he was arrested on charges of sodomy. The victim, a young man, had been lured into Gacy's car and once there, was assaulted by him. Gacy was charged and convicted of sodomy, a crime he tried to deny and downplay. How could someone so well-liked, so charming, commit such an act? And yet there it was. But even though the case was clear, the justice system failed to deliver the full consequences. Instead of a long sentence, Gacy served just 18 months in prison before being released early, on the promise that he had rehabilitated. Was that possible? Could he really have changed in such a short time, or was the system merely letting a predator slip through its fingers? During his time in prison, Gacy was able to continue to manipulate those around him, even serving as a model prisoner, keeping to himself, building a reputation as someone who had learned his lesson. But the warning signs were ignored. Why was he released so early? How did the system fail to see what others might have noticed? Or was it simply that no one was paying attention? Perhaps the world was too eager to see Gacy as the reformed man, too eager to believe that he had turned his life around, so eager in fact that they overlooked the signs of the monster he was becoming. How often do we let our assumptions cloud our judgment? How many times have we chosen to believe the lie because it was easier than facing the truth? After his release, Gacy moved back to Chicago, back to his business, back to his carefully curated life. But beneath his smiles, beneath the clown makeup, the darkness had only deepened. And yet life seemed to move forward. Gacy continued to hire young men, continued to host parties, continued to participate in the local community. He'd even make appearances as Pogo at local events, convincing everyone that the man they saw was the man they knew. They never suspected a thing. How could they? The mask was perfect, and the nightmare had only just begun. It wasn't long before the first victim disappeared, the first boy to fall under the spell of John Wayne Gacy's predatory charm. The name Timothy McCoy may not resonate with many, but for those who investigate Gacy's life, it marks the beginning of an unimaginable horror. Timothy, just 15 years old, was a runaway from Michigan who found himself on the streets of Chicago, searching for a way to survive. In January of 1972, he crossed paths with Gacy, who promised him a ride and the possibility of work. Gacy, ever the manipulator, knew exactly what to say. He offered the young boy a job with PDM contractors, an opportunity that, for McCoy, must have seemed like a lifeline. But what McCoy didn't know was that, in Gacy's world, no job was worth the price of survival. What must it have felt like to be so close to safety, only to be led into the nightmare that awaited him? Gacy brought Timothy to his home in Norwood Park, where, under the guise of kindness, he made his move. He invited McCoy into his house, served him breakfast, and made him feel comfortable, perhaps even safe, at least for a brief moment. But before Timothy could realize the danger, Gacy trapped him in his home, taking the boy's life in a cold, calculated manner. How many times had Gacy done this before, or at least thought about doing it? How did he view the lives of these young men, these boys he lured in with false promises? Were they nothing more than prey to him, nothing more than objects to be controlled? The pattern Gacy established with Timothy McCoy was a grim template for what would follow. His victims were often young men, barely out of their teenage years, searching for work or just passing through. Gacy was a master at drawing them in, using his role as a successful businessman to offer them something they desperately needed: a job, money, a place to stay. In his world, the lines between generosity and manipulation were blurred. For some, the initial encounter seemed innocent. But Gacy had an agenda that went beyond simple employment. As he had with Timothy McCoy, he invited his victims into his home, charming them with his affable demeanor, only to trap them in an increasingly horrifying cycle. Once inside, the game began. Gacy's signature trick, what would become one of his most infamous methods, was the handcuff trick. He would casually ask his victims to put their hands behind their back, offering them a pair of handcuffs as if it were some playful challenge. Once they were secured, Gacy would tighten the cuffs and the game would turn deadly. The manipulation, the power, the control, it all started with the click of those handcuffs. How could anyone know that the playful request for a handcuff demonstration was actually a ticket to a nightmare from which there would be no escape? Was it that Gacy enjoyed watching their trust dissolve, or was it the promise of complete control that fueled him? How did it feel to know you were trapped and helpless in the hands of someone who could take your life in an instant? Once his victims were subdued, Gacy's sadistic methods took over. He tortured them, assaulted them, and sexually dominated them, all while carefully maintaining the facade of a friendly neighbor, a responsible businessman, a community figure. The act of killing itself wasn't enough for Gacy. He needed to exert control over every aspect of the victim's life, to dominate them until they no longer had any autonomy. What drove this need to humiliate and degrade, to strip away all dignity before the final act? Was it just about power, or was there something more? Some twisted need to reclaim the agency he felt he'd lost in his own life? To make them as helpless as he once felt? The final step in Gacy's ritual was chilling in its simplicity. He would strangle his victims, often with a rope or a piece of clothing. The act of strangulation, he would later explain, was something that allowed him to feel complete control over his victims, ensuring they would die slowly, suffocating under his hands or the tension of the rope. How many of Gacy's victims fought, tried to scream, tried to escape? Was there any way to know that the life being drained from their bodies was just another sacrifice to his twisted need for dominance? Once the life had been taken, Gacy's ritual continued in the most horrifying way imaginable: the disposal of the bodies. What made him choose the crawl space beneath his house? Why that dark, confined place, just below the surface of his home, where guests walked and laughed, blissfully unaware of the macabre secret lurking underfoot? It wasn't enough for Gacy to take the lives of his victims. He needed to make their disappearances permanent, to ensure that no trace of them would ever be found. The crawl space became his personal burial ground, where their bodies were hidden away like trash, covered by dirt and the weight of Gacy's secrets. How many bodies lay there, buried beneath a house that to the outside world seemed so normal, so typical, like any other suburban home? Investigators would later recount the horror of discovering Gacy's crawl space, pulling out the bodies one by one, piece by piece, and revealing the extent of his depravity. The gruesome scene was one of the most shocking moments in the investigation, as they pieced together the puzzle of Gacy's double life. A life spent luring, controlling, and murdering young men with the kind of casual cruelty that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. What did it feel like to uncover such a dark, twisted truth? To know that the man they had once thought of as harmless was, in fact, one of the most terrifying killers in history? How do you reconcile the images of laughter and life with the horror of death and despair? As Gacy continued his reign of terror, the warning signs were there, blaring, screaming for attention. But they were ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. Gacy's ability to manipulate everyone around him, from family members to law enforcement, made it all too easy for him to continue his rampage. He wasn't just a killer, he was a master of deception, using his charm, his social standing, and his connections to avoid suspicion. How many times did people overlook the strange behavior, the odd moments, the small details that pointed to something far more dangerous? Was it just easier to believe in the version of Gacy they knew, the man who had a smile for everyone and a reputation for generosity? How many opportunities were missed to stop him before he claimed more victims? In the end, John Wayne Gacy was a man who held the lives of 33 young men in his hands, all while wearing a mask of normalcy, a mask of public approval. His double life, one of respectability and one of sadistic horror, would become one of the most chilling stories of American criminal history. It all started with the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest, a high school student from Norwood Park who vanished in December of 1978. Robert was last seen leaving work at a pharmacy, excited to meet with a contractor who had promised him a job that might help him escape the financial difficulties his family faced. He was never heard from again. His mother, distraught and frantic, began to search for answers. As Robert's case unfolded, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that, though not immediately clear, would eventually connect Robert's disappearance to a chilling string of missing persons. Robert's disappearance, seemingly isolated, soon attracted the attention of local police, but what they didn't know at the time was that Robert's fate had already been sealed the moment he stepped into the hands of a man with a deadly obsession, John Wayne Gacy. The case against Gacy started to take shape as detectives uncovered a web of lies and deceptions, each thread leading closer to the dark, twisted truth. As police began their investigation into Robert Piest's disappearance, Gacy quickly emerged as a prime suspect. He had been the last person seen with the teenager, and he had even promised to help him get a job, something that was strangely familiar given the numerous other young men Gacy had employed over the years. But at first, nothing could directly link him to the crime. It was a slow, methodical process of digging through his past, questioning witnesses and following up on leads, But the breakthrough came when Gacy's suspicious behavior began to reveal itself. How could someone, with the entire weight of suspicion building around them, act so casually? How could Gacy, with so many questions hanging in the air, not seem rattled? Was his indifference an indication of his guilt, or his ability to manipulate those around him? As the investigation continued, the police ramped up their efforts, placing Gacy under surveillance. They watched from a distance, hoping to catch him in a lie, to see some crack in his carefully constructed facade. But Gacy, ever the manipulator, played the game to perfection. He invited detectives into his home for meals, attempting to distract them from their task with his charm and calculated normalcy. How could someone so deeply involved in such horrific crimes maintain such an aura of calm, of friendly civility, while they knew the blood of so many young men was buried beneath their feet? What drove Gacy to such arrogance, to believe he could outsmart the very law that sought to bring him down? Was it the thrill of the game itself, the mind games he played with those who were trying to catch him? Despite his attempts to deflect suspicion, the investigators were closing in. Gacy's charm and bravado couldn't last forever, and the police were not about to let up. They obtained search warrants and began their search of Gacy's property, hoping to find some concrete evidence that would expose his dark secrets. The breakthrough came when, after days of watching him, the police finally obtained permission to search his home. Gacy had always kept the police at arm's length, but now they had the right to dig deeper. And as they began their search of the property, the officers quickly found themselves face to face with a discovery that would shake them to their core. The first clue came in the form of a smell, a pungent, overpowering odor that filled the air around Gacy's home. It was unbearable, unlike anything the officers had ever encountered before. The scent was so revolting, so overpowering, that it was impossible to ignore. It was the smell of death, the smell of a place where lives had been extinguished, buried, and forgotten. How could anyone have lived in this house, so close to the horror buried beneath, without noticing the stench that permeated the walls? Was this the smell of guilt, the odor of a man who had been hiding his crimes in plain sight for far too long? How had Gacy managed to convince everyone, his neighbors, his friends, his colleagues, that everything was normal when such a horrifying reality lurked beneath his very home? The crawl space beneath Gacy's house became, as investigators would soon realize, his personal mass grave. It was here, in the darkness beneath the floorboards, that Gacy had hidden the bodies of his victims, each one a silent testament to his cruelty and control. The space itself was small, confined, but for Gacy, it was the perfect hiding place for his monstrous acts, isolated and private, yet right under the noses of those who thought they knew him. As the police began digging, they uncovered the remains of victim after victim, each one hidden beneath the dirt and debris. There was no way to count the number of lives lost in this small, confined space. How many young men had Gacy lured into his house and buried in the same place, with the same chilling disregard for their humanity? Each body pulled from the crawl space was a piece of the puzzle that was Gacy's horrific double life. The bodies were often decomposed in varying stages of decay, making it clear that Gacy's reign of terror had lasted for years. As the officers unearthed one victim after another, they couldn't help but wonder how long it had taken for Gacy to become so comfortable with this brutality, to bury each victim without hesitation, without remorse. Was there a moment where the guilt of what he was doing finally hit him, or was his capacity for cruelty so deeply ingrained that it never occurred to him to stop? With everybody uncovered, the full scale of Gacy's horrors began to sink in. It was no longer a question of whether Gacy was guilty. The evidence was undeniable. The crawl space had become a macabre tomb, a place where Gacy's darkest secrets were laid bare for all to see. And with each body, the case against Gacy became stronger, more irrefutable. How could he have lived such a seemingly normal life, held such a prominent position in the community, all while committing such monstrous acts behind closed doors? Was it simply because he was a master manipulator, or did the system fail to see the signs of a killer in their midst until it was too late? Gacy, ever the cold and calculated predator, finally confessed to the unthinkable. He had killed at least 33 young boys and men, luring them into his home with promises of work, drugs, or simply his charm, only to imprison, torture, and murder them in unspeakable ways. Each life was extinguished with the same cruel indifference, and yet, as he recounted these murders, Gacy's demeanor was chilling in its calmness. There was no sign of regret, no remorse. Instead, his voice was steady, his words deliberate, almost as if he were describing someone else's actions, as though the horror he had inflicted on so many was somehow detached from his own identity. Was it the arrogance of a man who believed he could control every situation, even his own downfall? Or was it something deeper, An absolute lack of empathy that allowed him to recount these crimes with pride, as if they were mere footnotes in the story of his life? As Gacy confessed, the world could scarcely grasp how a man who had once been seen as a respectable figure, a Democratic Party precinct captain, a business owner, and a friendly neighbor, could transform into a monster so monstrous that even the idea of human decency seemed foreign to him. What had driven him to these extremes? Was it his own warped need for control, a desire to dominate others so utterly that their lives became nothing more than objects to be discarded when he grew bored? Or had something twisted inside of him long before he became Pogo the Clown, long before he had a successful career and a place in the community? What truly lay behind the mask of the charming businessman who entertained children as a party clown and then plunged them into a nightmare they couldn't escape? As the confessions poured out, the world grappled with the enormity of his crimes, and yet, even as Gacy's admission confirmed the horror, it also provided a disturbing insight into his mind. There was no remorse in his eyes. In fact, he seemed proud, almost detached from the lives he had so cruelly taken. Was this the face of evil, or was there something deeper at play? Could a man like Gacy, who had been so successful in hiding his crimes for so long, have ever been capable of truly understanding the weight of his actions, or was he simply a product of his own delusions? The trial that followed was nothing short of a media spectacle. The courtroom, filled with reporters and spectators, became the stage for Gacy's final performance as he stood trial for the murders of 33 young men and boys. The defense team, knowing the overwhelming evidence against him, sought to argue that Gacy was not in control of his actions, that he was insane, driven by some dark force that he could neither understand nor resist. They argued that his actions were not those of a rational man but of someone whose mind had fractured beyond repair. The insanity plea seemed, to many, to be Gacy's final attempt to avoid the full weight of justice, to escape the consequences of his actions by hiding behind a psychological diagnosis. But the prosecution, armed with the grim evidence, the confessions, and the testimonies of those who had survived Gacy's attacks, presented a different story. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully planned and executed each murder, a man who had preyed on young men for years, with no signs of mental illness or delusion, only a deep, depraved desire for control and dominance. Gacy was not mad. He was evil, and the prosecutors made it clear that his actions were not the result of a fractured mind but the calculated, horrific choices of a man who believed himself above the law. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Gacy became irrefutable. The bodies, the confessions, the survivors, all painted a portrait of a man whose evil knew no bounds. Yet Gacy, ever confident, sat in the courtroom with an air of detachment, almost as if he were above it all. His demeanor seemed to mock the very idea of justice, as though he were daring the court to challenge him. How could someone so cold, so unfeeling, appear so calm and collected, even as the evidence piled up against him? Was this a man who had so thoroughly disconnected from his humanity that he could face the music without flinching, or was he simply too arrogant to believe that justice could touch him? The jury, however, had no such doubts. They deliberated for a short time, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence, and found Gacy guilty on all counts. The verdict was unanimous, and in that moment, the courtroom exhaled a collective breath, a breath that had been held for years as Gacy's reign of terror had cast a long shadow over the community. But for Gacy, the real punishment was only beginning. The jury sentenced him to death, and as the sentence was handed down, Gacy's cold, indifferent expression remained unchanged. He had spent years hiding behind masks, first as a clown and then as a man playing the part of a respectable citizen, but now there would be no more masks. There was nowhere left to hide. The death sentence seemed almost fitting for a man whose life had been marked by the taking of others' lives, but Gacy's journey was far from over. The question remained, what would it take to bring a man like Gacy to truly face the consequences of his actions? Would his final moments, his death, be an act of closure for those he had harmed, or was there something even more unsettling at play? As Gacy faced the final chapter of his life, the world was left to wonder if there was any justice that could ever truly match the enormity of the suffering he had caused. In the aftermath of Gacy's conviction, the city of Chicago, and especially the community in Norwood Park, found itself grappling with the aftermath of a horror that had lived among them undetected for so long. For the families of the victims, the trial and the subsequent media frenzy could never bring their sons, brothers, and friends back. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, forced to contend with the grief and trauma of knowing that someone they had trusted, someone who had appeared so normal, had taken their loved ones from them in the most brutal and horrific way possible. There could be no healing in such a tragedy, no sense of closure that would make up for the loss they had endured. John Wayne Gacy's final days were spent on death row, but even his execution in 1994 by lethal injection failed to truly end the pain for the families. His death did not bring back the 33 victims, nor could it erase the nightmare that his crimes had imprinted on their lives. But Gacy's legacy is not only that of a brutal killer, it also serves as a stark reminder of how deeply the human capacity for evil can run, and how, sometimes, those who seem the most normal are capable of the darkest actions. As his name lives on in infamy, Gacy continues to serve as a warning. A warning that evil doesn't always have an obvious face, and sometimes the people who seem to be the least suspicious are the ones hiding the most insidious secrets. And though Gacy's execution might have closed one chapter of this horrific story, his legacy remains a haunting presence in both the criminal justice system and the collective consciousness of a nation forever changed by the horror of what happened behind closed doors in suburban Chicago. If you found this story chilling, if you want to hear more about the darkest corners of true crime, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Every week, we dive into new stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, uncovering the secrets that hide beneath the surface. Join us as we continue to explore the world of true crime and uncover the mysteries that lurk behind closed doors.